Hello, hello. Welcome to Top Shelf Backpacking. Today we're going over my 5 worst things of hiking 100 miles on the PCT in Washington. Starting with number 5, the isolation. I was out there in later July, kind of middle of July, and although it was pretty common to pass a couple of thru hikers day to day, maybe 4 or 5, sometimes up to probably a dozen, because I was hiking southbound, weren't that many people hiking my same direction. Every single night at camp, I was solo. One of those nights was by choice because there were a lot of weekenders at one of the more beautiful sites, but it was pretty packed and I'd have a tough time finding a good spot to pitch, so I decided to keep on hiking. Ended up sleeping on the side of a hill that night. Not a great night, but my number 5 worst part of hiking 100 miles on the PCT in Washington was the isolation. Number 4 worst part of hiking 100 miles on the PCT in Washington was the wild temp swings at night. When I would crawl into my tent, it was often in the 70s, so I would be on top of my 20-degree enlightened equipment quilt inside the tent. However, by midnight, it would have cooled down significantly, so I'd have to get into the quilt, and by 3 or 4 a.m. it was in the 40s, low 40s most of the time, so I would be struggling to try and wrap that quilt around me nice and tight, because obviously I was too lazy to actually do my pad straps at 3 o'clock in the morning when I was still partially asleep. So the number 4 worst part of hiking 100 miles was the temperature swings at night, making it tough to sleep. The 3rd worst part of hiking 100 miles through the PCT in Washington were the burn zones. Granted, the burn zones meant less bugs. I appreciated that part. However, they were exposed, they were hot, they were dusty. It's just tough to see all that devastation around you, and unfortunately there is still a fire burning in the area I hiked through, so it will probably never look the same again. Not sure how much of the trail will be affected through there, but it was just tough to hike through those parts. You do get some incredible views, but the coolness, the lushness of the forest was definitely missed in those few burn sections I went through. So the 3rd worst part of hiking was going through the burn zones. The 2nd worst part of hiking 100 miles through the PCT in Washington was the pain. I did not prepare nearly as much as I knew I should have, and in making some changes to my footwear led to some blisters, which I haven't had in probably the last 5 years of hiking. But I did avoid the turf toe, so that was appreciated. I did get some chafing on the last day, probably thanks to changing the shirt I was wearing, and overall just kind of sore and was stiff for a few days after, probably due to the lack of preparation and just pushing for that many miles, trying to do all 100 miles in 5 days. So the 2nd worst part of hiking was the pain. The number 1 worst part of hiking the 100 miles through the PCT in Washington was the bugs. I have had some pretty bad bug situations before, but never so bad that I actually had to put on a head net. I had the head net on a good majority of the last 3 days, and often would try to eat inside the tent because the bugs were so bad you would be inhaling them if you attempted to eat outside of the tent. Thankfully I don't respond much to bug bites, but I got probably hundreds of them. I looked polka dotted by the time all was done. So the number 1 worst part of hiking 100 miles through the PCT in Washington was the bugs. Don't get me wrong, I had a great time hiking the 100 miles through the PCT in Washington in 5 days, but it was not without its downsides, the poor sleep, the bug bites, the pain, but overall it was a worthwhile experience. For more information on everything you see on this channel, visit topshelfbackpacking.com, and until I see you again, cheers.